With me now is Conservative London Assembly member and the chair of the Police and Crime Committee, Shaun Bailey. Shaun, fantastic to have you in the studio for once. Normally we're talking down the line. This is a shocking case, but it is the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Especially when you look at things that might be going on in cities such as London. We've got children who are essentially being abused or tortured with sort of strange medieval concepts of witchcraft and superstitious beliefs and related to faith. We've got other young kids being groomed and dragged into drugs-related gangs with county lines. What is going on?
I think there's two things to say. This kind of abuse has always happened to children. I think the difference now is the scale. But in a sense, there's two icebergs here. There's the iceberg that is people attacking their children, but the much larger iceberg, which is neglect. So we're all focused on attack. We have horrific cases that drive the public perception of these things. But actually, there's a vast number of children who are just neglected, and they make their way through. School picks up some things here, maybe youth work there, but they're just neglected, and that rolls on and has a real impact on their life and then what they do as adults. And then we have the other piece that we always look at, which is where the law, the authorities as we see them, have failed, and we focused on those cases, rightly so, but I think there's a bigger piece around what are we doing about children who are being neglected.
Is there something socially as well that we desperately need to address and talk about? Is there perhaps something that's gone on lately? And without wanting to point the finger of blame at people, perhaps there are people, frankly, becoming parents who should not be becoming parents. And perhaps they're thinking, well, you know, if I do this, then it's a system whereby I'll receive child support, I might get a house, or there's broken homes with, you know, various different secondary parents, step parents coming in and out of children's lives. And this, frankly, creates a toxic cocktail in some households that is putting children at risk. But we're not brave enough to talk about that.
I would look at it differently. Our children are under more attack now than they've ever been. Of course, there's a dreaded internet and social media, but also there's an adult way in which we teach children. For instance, we call them young people, which suggests they're a distinct and separate set of people. They are not. They live and breathe as well as their families and parents do. I think we also are very reticent to criticise parents because we all know parenting is hard. I have two children at home. They run rings around me. But the piece is this. There's culture versus the law. And culture wins every time. If you have a culture that protects children, you have a culture that looks after the broader network of children you might come across, then you have better outcomes with children. And I'll say this to anybody listening now, would you challenge a teenager? And the point is, we have over years let our teenagers just become this strange, exotic, dangerous thing. I come from a community where old people would I remember being on a bus and having my feet on a chair and this old woman just staring in my face until I moved my feet. She sat down and she said, you know, what's your mum's name? And she sort of got into it with me. We wouldn't do that now because somewhere along the law we've made children exotic, but also we've forgotten that we are adults and should treat them as children, which means to protect them, but also sometimes challenge them.
But this requires leadership, doesn't it? I've had a couple of guests on the first hour who both said to me that over the last decade there have been immense cuts to things like social services and cuts to frontline public services, which have potentially all contributed to an overburdening of a system which is now clearly not working as well as it should. But like you said, when it comes to culture, we need role models, we need leadership, we need people at the top bringing back old-fashioned values, family values and talking tough. You're from the Conservative Party, the party supposedly of conservative values, small c conservative values. Where are they? Why is Boris Johnson not standing up in Parliament talking about this?
Let's break this down. So your former guests said it's about the state, it's about, you know, not being enough money. Actually, they're wrong. That's part of the problem. We now have a group of people who think the state parent their children. We now have a group of people who think, well, if I say anything about what's going on next door, the state will spirit away those people's children, and I don't want to be a grass. Yes, money does help, but it's more than money. It's what you do with that money. You could give people £1 billion, it could be wasted, or something good could happen. And the other thing is, when you talk about role models, that is our other problem. We think footballers are role models. We think Richard Branson's a role model. The first and primary and most important role model in your world should be your parents. There's an old British saying, you sort of grow up to be your parents. And as you go through that and you're middle age, you sort of appreciate the fact you're becoming your parents because you respected what they did. They had the authority in your home. They had the authority in your community. When you over-professionalise and when you parachute people in, you weaken communities because they send the responsibility elsewhere. So I think we have to be careful about how much we professionalise, and we also have to be a little bit more robust in what we ask parents to take responsibility for.
But, I mean, look, let's think about it. Say if, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister now, I would have no doubt that she'd have stood at that dispatch box and really laid down the law with an iron fist about declining moral standards and social standards in our community. Do you think that the current government sometimes look like they're having too much of a laugh to be actually pushing forward these critical messages?
I would say they'd get cancelled. If you stand up, well, I am a card-carrying conservative, I go to church, I'm married, I've got 2 kids. If I say anything positive about that situation, I get cancelled. There's lots of people who benefit from weaker communities. I would tell anybody all day long, if you want to keep your children safe, there's a number of things you should do. Being married, like it or not, I know you can't make people stay together, but the children of married people do better. Less time in jail, less time in hospital, they make more money. It is a fact. Keep your children young. It's a fact. We let our children grow up too quickly. Anybody watching this now, ask themselves if they've let their children watch a movie, for instance, that they're underaged for. Now, it might not be a big thing with that one movie, but it puts an idea in your child's mind that they can push and challenge boundaries. Ask yourself, if you're a school governor, how your children relate to the teachers, and do you intervene in that, or are you afraid of parents? We've set up a whole thing, not just the government, the council culture, everybody else, has set up a thing where you cannot challenge anybody. And the worst, where that manifests itself worst is in the lives of our young people. They surveyed the young people of this country and they came bottom in Europe for happiness. They came second bottom in the world. And that says something about how the adults around them are operating. And I'd argue it's not a case of just going back to old-fashioned values. That would be useful. But it is a case of taking some responsibility.
Now, very briefly, because we are sort of running out of time, but I must ask you, do you think that your party in government are going to do things, take those bold steps, such as putting porn behind at least age verification? Are they going to do it?
I really, really hope so. And I'll tell you something now, I'm one of the people in that party, the Conservative Party, who will be pushing for that. Because like I say, with sex, drugs and rock and roll, if you haven't had enough by the time you're 18, you can sit in your room and fill your head with it. But if you've had too much, we can't take it back. But what you have to do here, anybody watching this now, be you Conservative or not, you've got to support the government in taking these steps. Because the minute Boris stands up and says something like that, someone will try to cancel him. I know for a fact he'd like to have these things go forward. There's a number of people who would, but we have an avalanche of people who are against it.